Hey everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of Green Scare. Today we have a very special guest, Peter Daniel Young. Peter was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison after raiding numerous fur farms and liberating thousands of mink and foxes. Nowadays, he's written numerous books on the topic of animal liberation and does talks at colleges and other events. Hey Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey man, thanks for having me.
So to start off with, what's with that video of you on YouTube confronting a Hot Topic cashier over their company's support for terrorism?
You know, um, this guy that apparently that's raising money for, he was convicted of basically terrorism offenses. It's really kind of, I don't know if you have any personal knowledge about this, but it's a little bit strange that they would carry this to the store.
I
Have you ever heard of it? Do you know anything about this?
no.
Have you sold many copies of it?
I haven't even seen it until now.
Oh, really? 'Cause I think he got convicted of like bombing like a fur factory or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but there's all these bands on it that are raising money for him. I thought it was a little bit. See, he's got the bolt cutters. I don't know.
That is a deep cut. You might be a cop to have dug that deep and found that video. I don't even know. I haven't even thought of that in like 15 years. And I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, when I was in prison, there was a CD compilation that was put together with some fairly, bands that were big enough to actually get the CD into Hot Topic when Hot Topic sold CDs and records. And so right when I got out of prison, I was like, I want to go. I thought it'd be funny to like go to Hot Topic, get the CD, go up to the cashier and act like an indignant customer saying, why are you selling CDs to support terrorism? And I just thought it'd be funny. And so I was with some friends at a mall in LA and we went to Hot Topic and I went up to the cashier and I was like, you guys know that you're supporting terrorism? Like, look at this. And there's like literally a picture of me on the CD. I'm like, do you see what you're doing here? And it was funny for about 10 seconds till it wasn't. But then my friend put it on YouTube.
Yeah, you were actually on the cover there?
It wasn't a photo. It was an artistic rendition of me. So
Oh,
I
okay.
understand why the cashier maybe didn't pick up on the joke, but yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even actually know if it was you on that or what this compilation was. So who was on the compilation?
It was, oh my God, I'm embarrassed. It's been so long. I have a whole case of them in my closet as we speak. Uh it was like kind of a lot of the hardcore bands at the time. So I think it was like With Honor and like 108 and Himza and I was really excited because 108 is like a hardcore band I was really into, and their first track that they recorded, as far as I understand, in many years made it to that comp. So I was really honored to see that. It was a whole bunch of bands. I anyone that wants a copy, you should reach out to me. I'll send you one. I have about 300 in my closet right now.
That's amazing. So, Peter, you're vegan straight edge, right?
That's right.
That's right. So you, what vegan straight edge? What got you into the vegan straight edge scene? Which bands did you listen to? How did you sort of enter that scene, etc.?
Yeah, my entry point. So for those that don't know, a lot of our listeners probably or viewers probably have no idea what we're talking about. But
Oh yeah.
there's like the punk rock scene, which is sort of like so vague as to be kind of meaningless. But then there's all these subgenres. So you've got hardcore within punk rock, and then you've got straight edge hardcore, and then you've got within that you've got the vegan straight edge scene. So my entry point was a little bit kind of serpentine. I actually came into it through the crust punk scene, and I was never like a crust punk like Mohawk and all that, but there's a band called Drop Dead, and they were kind of like a grind, I guess you call grind band, and they had an animal rights message. This is before I was vegetarian. That was probably the band that got me into being vegan. Was this band Drop Dead? But they weren't a vegan straight edge band. But then from there, I started to seek out other bands that had that message, which led me to bands like Green Rage, bands like Abnegation, Earth Crisis, those kind of bands. So I came in through crust and then eventually found vegan straight edge. And I still enjoy both genres, but vegan straight edge is where I feel like most aligned.
You listen to Raid and Vegan Reich?
Raid, Vegan Reich. I mean, if I was gonna give anyone a good representation of like some of the best vegan straight edge, I give them the last five songs that Raid ever recorded. Those are like primo. But yeah, Vegan Reich, who I hear is recording new material. I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
And God, there's so many bands. Framework and Abnegation was a big one for me. I would argue I have the best vegan straight edge vinyl record collection about 20 feet away from me where we are right now. So just about anything that ever was released, I've got it.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I really like Raid, especially the stuff in Hands Off the Animals is their second album, right?
Yeah, that was a compilation, I think, of everything they recorded minus some demo tracks. So the first 5 tracks off of that are incredible. It's funny, actually, the singer, who's not vegan anymore, which is unfortunate. He's still
Yeah,
vegetarian, but he
vegetarian.
runs a record store in Arcata, California, and I was passing through there, and I popped in and introduced myself. We talked a little bit.
How did you first get interested in veganism and activism? What key moments in your life helped develop your concern towards animal and earth liberation?
There was no big, kind of like moment. It was, I sort of got like pebbled with things throughout my teenage years. If you want to go way back, we actually had neighbors when I was it's like 1986. So I was like, I don't know how old I was. I was like 8 years old or something. And they were vegan. And this isn't a time when like, like nobody was vegan, right? So we had vegan neighbors, and my parents told us they were like kind of crazy. And so that was my first exposure to veganism and at all. And then as I got older, I was just kind of getting hit with it here and there, and I just really connected with the plight of animals. There was I remember I was really into the Beastie Boys, like the band, and when I was like early high school, and I remember one of the Beastie Boys was vegetarian, and my friends and I got in this big debate. Like someone said, "Oh, it's stupid that one of the guys from the Beastie Boys is vegetarian," and I was like 14, and I was like not even close to being vegetarian. I remember passionately arguing the vegetarian perspective in this debate, not even ever having considered being vegetarian. I just felt like I connected with it. So there was that, and then when I got into the punk rock music scene, that's where things really, I really started to get more in depth into the philosophy behind it, and not just that, but activism as well. And I think there was one moment it's not very like story worthy, but it was a big turning point for me where I was watching television, and I was like, let's see, I became vegan when I was 17. So I was probably 16 at this point. And I was thumbing through the channels, and I don't even know if this is still a thing, but they used to have like what's called public access. So like the FTC or FCC required that one station be set aside for the public to just like show up at the station and just do whatever they wanted to. And so it's just like it's weird. Anyway, you could just rent out an hour of TV is the point. And so someone had like booked an hour on the station, and they were just showing slaughterhouse footage. And I remember I was thumbing through, and I caught a glimpse. I was like not even 10 seconds, and I just like mortified. And it just I just skip past it because I was so shaken by what I saw. But that really stuck with me. And so that planted the seed. I became vegan probably less than a year later.
Wow. So you raided multiple fur farms and liberated thousands of animals. Where did you get the idea to do that, and what was it like?
Raiding fur farms. Well, first of all, certainly not my idea. There was I kind of caught the early end of that trend in the animal liberation front in the history of the ALF, but there were definitely quite a few that had happened before I got involved with that. So starting about 1986, activists had figured out that mink, one, were genetically wild, and two, they were very easy targets. These mink farms, you've got thousands of animals in these outdoor sheds, and they're usually separated from the outside world by just a fence, which is oftentimes very easy to fell. And these are very sort of crude operations. And so activists started to figure out that you can go to these farms, cut the fences away, open the cages, release the animals, and you can save thousands of animals in a very short amount of time with very minimal risk. And so I think there was there was some early mink farm raids around 86. There was like one actually outside Seattle, which I had nothing to do with, but in Olympia. There was some up in British Columbia, in Canada, and I think there's an early one in Minnesota. So there were some of these raids happening, and word was just kind of getting around. And this is before the internet, so people, news of these actions would spread through publications. Like there's one called Underground, one called No Compromise. And so you would get these publications, and you would read about what had happened like the last, 3, 4, 5 months. And so there's this tremendous amount of latency between when things were happening, when you'd hear about them. And but those publications had a big impact because you would just get everything in one big, fire hose of information. And so I remember just sitting around reading about these fur farm raids, and it just made a lot of sense. And my friends and I at the time were scheming very actively on what we could do to directly save animals' lives, not just symbolic protest, which we were already doing. So this made the most sense just logically because you could save a tremendous number of animals in a very short amount of time without any skills. And the risk, because you're in a rural environment and it's not like, breaking into a lab, which maybe probably carries a higher level of risk, where you're in an outdoor environment, and so the risk was sort of diminished because you could, approach the property more easily. You could get access to it more easily. You can get away more easily. And so we just did the math and said, hey, this is the best bang for our buck. The risk to yield ratio is very, very favorable. So we began researching fur farms, mink farms around Seattle. And it was in the summer of 96 that I traveled to Minneapolis and I met some activists there. So I was in Seattle, traveled on a Greyhound bus to Minneapolis, and I met some activists out there. And I remember I went to like a potluck, and somebody was just like distributing fairy dust throughout. They were just like throwing out copies of this publication, making sure everyone at this vegan potluck got a copy of this document. And someone handed it to me, and it was called The Final Nail, and it had a list of every single fur farm that was known in the country. And the list was probably the result of compiled from documents that were stolen by Rod Coronado from various fur farm research facilities several years before. And it was finally, these addresses were finally coming to light. No one really knew where these farms were up until this point. And so I got this document, and it had a list of every fur farm that was known, and then a how-to guide also as part of it on how to raid fur farms. And by the way, if anyone wants to, like, I actually have, so I released a book recently that actually has the Final Nail included in it. So you can see it was like basically just a collection of, it's kind of random, I turned right to it, but it was a collection of like fur farm security guide, like how to bypass security, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a pretty detailed publication. So I took that back to Seattle and got together with my friends, and I said, hey, I think this is the path. Because at that time we'd been, we had carried out quite a few actions. Most of them were just sort of property damage level stuff, breaking windows and things like that. And we had, but obviously, like I said, we were trying to escalate. So we were like going to factory farms, which are fairly easy, but you have to find homes for the animals. That's a huge logistical burden. And so we were also scouting out laboratories, and we were, actually pretty competent at getting inside some of these buildings, but they still presented the challenge of what do we do with the animals, and some unknowns around security and things we just hadn't quite figured out yet. And so it just made sense to go for the softest targets that would also save the most number of animals. So we went to a fur farm outside Seattle in Granite Falls, which actually fairly recently was determined to be closed, which is some closure for me because it was the first farm I went to. And we walked up to the farm in the middle of the night, with tons of swagger. We were just like, we own this place. And we walked up and there's a confidence that comes from never having been caught doing anything yet. And so we just rolled up, and there's like, 4 or 5 of us, and we'd parked like right outside, and we walk up. We're not even thinking about alarms. We're not thinking about anything. We're just like, at this point, we're just trying to scout it out. And then we're like, oh, we'll just come back like once we have like bolt cutters and we're like really ready to go. And so we're just kind of poking around. I'm seeing mink for the first time. And actually, to be factually correct, it was actually the second farm. The first farm, we just kind of duck our heads in and then ducked out really quick. But we actually went back at night, and I turn around, and there at some point, and I see this man marching up the driveway. I assume it was a man. And he looked like he had like a silhouette of something. I think it was a shovel, could have been a gun, not totally sure. We didn't ask any questions. We all just ran. And so we learned later that fur farm had photoelectric sensors around the perimeter of the farm. And so we later learned how to bypass those. But that was kind of my early experience with farms. So once we kind of figured that stuff out, we began to scout out farms around the Northwest. And that eventually led to one. And there's a whole lot of history here. You can ask questions if you want, but we were doing a lot of things around the Seattle area that eventually kind of got us on the radar of the police, separate from the fur farms. And so once we're on the radar of the police, it became a little more challenging for us to do bigger actions without being the prime suspects. We had a house that we lived in that got raided by the police, and they found a bunch of ALF literature and a bunch of like things that indicated to the police that we were involved in ALF activity. They found bolt cutters. They found, like I said, literature. They found ketamine, which is used to tranquilize animals if you want to transport animals in large animals. And so they found a bunch of stuff, and they're like, all right, these people are the ones who are doing all this stuff around Seattle. So when we decided to actually really go big with the mink farm thing, we end up leaving Seattle. And so it was initially going to be three of us. Then one person backed out. So it was just two of us. So we drove from Seattle all the way eastward across the Midwest, which was largely untouched by the ALF at that point. And that was part of the strategy. One was to get away from an area where we were known. And then two, to put us in an area that was fertile ground, so to speak, for ALF activity because they just didn't have their guard up yet. And so we started out in South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin. We hit 6 farms in a short amount of time. And there's a whole lot I could say about that, but ultimately I was arrested for that.
How did you get caught?
We got caught because we underestimated how networked the fur farmers were. So what we didn't anticipate was when one farm gets hit, this is pre-internet, or pre-internet as we know it. So the farmers would get on their phone tree and just call every other farmer and say, "Hey, I just got hit last night." And so a 3-state region would go on high alert when this would happen. And so we were oblivious to this. And so we hit one farm and we just moseyed on down the road. And sometimes we were not even traveling more than an hour between farms. And so we were running into situations frequently on this trip because, for every one farm we would hit, we would look at 7 or 10. And we were running into situations frequently where we'd pull up to a farm and the farmer would just be waiting for us. Or we'd drive by a farm and we would have someone immediately pull out and start following us. And they were all waiting for us. And so news of this red Geo Metro was circulating through the fur farming industry. And we had that swagger I referenced earlier. And then we also had a little bit of ignorance about how networked they were. So by the time we had raided our 6th farm, we were in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. We went to the largest fur farm in the country at the time, and we drove past it, or actually into the driveway by accident. And which is still the largest farm in the country. It's still open. And the fur farmer had saw us and recognized from their phone network, oh, this is the car that everyone's looking for right now. So she gave chase. And I say chase, but we didn't even know we were being followed. And it was, this is 97. And it was pretty early to have a cell phone, but it's that mink farm money. She had a cell phone. And so she's calling the police, while she's tailing us, saying, "Hey, I've got the suspects right in front of me." So the police pulled us over. They asked to search our vehicle, and we told them no. And then they impounded our vehicle to go to a judge to get a search warrant, which is what they eventually were granted. So the police just basically seized our car, dumped us out in the winter in Wisconsin, and said, "You guys are on your own, but you can't have your car." And so we were stranded overnight in Wisconsin. We knew that if they got the warrant, what they found inside would implicate us in, if not everything we'd done, a lot of what we had done. And so once that happened, we became fugitives at that point. And I always regret not, what we should have done is, since the car was impounded, and it's a small town, there's probably only one tow lot. I always regret we had all night just to wander around because we had no car, we had nothing. And I always regret not going to that tow lot and just hopping the fence, breaking out the window, taking all the incriminating evidence out of my car and getting rid of it, because that would have solved most of my problems at that point. But anyway, so we were eventually indicted. When they got the warrant, we were eventually indicted for that series of mink farm raids.
And you spent 7 years on the run as a fugitive, right?
Right.
What was that like?
So yeah, it's funny because there was some years when that question would be put to me a lot and I couldn't talk about it because for legal reasons. And now that I can talk about it, nobody ever asked me. So it was an interesting time. I had just returned to Seattle. So what happened was, when our car got searched, it was a whole year. I think it was 11 months before we actually got indicted. And so I was a fugitive for those 11 months. I was living like a fugitive, but I hadn't actually been charged with anything yet. And so by the time, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months goes by, and I'm checking the internet every day looking for news that I'd been indicted, and that news never came. So by the time 11 months rolls around, 11 months later, I was like, I'm just going to go back to Seattle and resurface, because I think if they were going to charge me, they would have done it already. So what I think they were doing is actually waiting for me to resurface. And so I went back to Seattle, and within days I was indicted. And I went back to Seattle, and I had I was moving into an apartment with a friend of mine, and the old roommate hadn't moved out yet. So I had like 3 days to kill. So I went up to Bellingham, Washington. I hopped a freight train up to Bellingham, and I was just walking around Bellingham killing a few days before I could move into this place. And I was indicted during that time. And a friend of mine knew I was in Bellingham, and he got news of the indictment. And he drove up to Bellingham. There's no cell phones at this point, so he just starts going. He's like, "Where would Peter Young be in Bellingham?" So he starts going to all the record stores, and he finds me in a record store, and he walks up to me and he hands me this printout of the FBI press release. And I remember that his words exactly. All he says was, "Your life's gonna have to change." And he hands me this press release, and I read it. And it says 80 subjects facing 82 years in prison. And so I was given $800. I remember that number very clearly, because that was all I had to keep me out of prison, was $800. And he basically just goes, "Run for your life." So I did exactly that. I moved to Tucson, Arizona, where I spent the next 6 months trying to process it and figure out what I wanted to do. I got an apartment. Well, first thing, I already had an ID under a fake name. That was the most important thing. And I was very fortunate that I kind of already had that worked out before I was actually indicted. So I had already gotten an ID using forged documents, like a real ID card, using forged documents. So that really is the hardest part of being a fugitive, is getting that ID. Once you have that ID, it's really just a matter of like not calling your parents, like not doing obvious dumb things. So I had the ID, so it's just a matter of, okay, well, I'll just go somewhere where nobody knows me. So I went to Tucson, Arizona. It's a college town. It's cheap. I worked at a Goodwill thrift store. I was just like laying low for like 6 months. And before that, my life was great. I was like traveling, I was having adventures, I was hitchhiking, and I was like working at this thrift store, and I living in this studio apartment by myself. And I thought, this sucks. This is not, this is, if I'm going to go down, I want to go down living the life I want to live. So I just resumed my old life, and I proceeded to continue traveling and hitchhiking. And I resumed my previously partially criminal life, in a way you probably should not as a fugitive. But it's the life that I wanted to live. And so, anyway, I'm going on, but the next 7 years was a, a lot of me having, well, obviously a double life, but I was the life where nobody knew who I was, right? So I had a separate group of friends, and I was like in the punk rock scene. I just had to kind of avoid anyone that might be directly involved in activism who might recognize me. And then I had my old life with old friends that I would kind of resurface and revisit them. And it was always interesting because I would kind of resurface, and I had like, we'd have like burner email accounts set up between us. And I had ways to like contact people from who knew who I was from my past life. And I would kind of resurface and I'd reconnect with them, and they would say, "Hey, if you're going out this town, here's this person. They're solid. They will take care of you. They're trustworthy." And I would sort of get passed around this network of like trusted activists, like people um, that were vetted as people that could be trusted to, not turn me in, and who had proven themselves as activists. So I was kind of getting this very highly curated experience of or network of activists at that point. It wasn't just random person that's been doing protests for a few months. It was like people that have really been tested. And so I got a really densely high quality group of people in that part of my life. And I was meeting new people because one person would refer me to another person, and that's how that went. So which later became very important. That network of people became very important to the FBI to try to figure out. And they eventually actually offered me a year off my sentence if I would just tell them who I had spent time with when I was a fugitive. And obviously I, did not take them up on that offer, but so I had that double life, and I would, resurface and see old friends, and I'd go back to my, and so, there was a time where by the time I got arrested, not at the exact time I got arrested, but shortly before that, I had like a girlfriend that was like, I was living with, and like, didn't know who I was. And I had all these friends, they had no idea who I was.
Wow.
And there was a lot of like close calls. I was living in San Diego, and then I found out that my co-defendant who had snitched on me had also just moved to San Diego completely randomly, and was also like showing up in the same like punk rock venues that I was going to. So I had to like leave San Diego. There was just a lot of chaos. But so I eventually got arrested. I was living in Santa Cruz, California. I had like an apartment a couple blocks from the beach. Things were going really well, and I got arrested at Starbucks because they said that I was shoplifting CDs, which I actually was not. I mean, I kind of was, but not exactly. But what I had actually done at that point was not arrestable. So I actually do believe they knew. I think they wanted to hide the fact they knew who I was. So
Hmm.
there was this sort of staged arrest, in my opinion, where they were trying to use the pretext of, oh, this guy's stealing CDs to arrest him. But my theory that I think is pretty much is backed up pretty well by the circumstantial evidence is that I had got snitched on, and they wanted to protect the snitch, so they created this kind of fake pretext for arresting me, the shoplifting thing at Starbucks, and
Hmm.
so I was arrested, and the next chapter began.
Wait, so were you shoplifting or not?
I did have the intent to shoplift, but I had not actually
Okay.
shoplifted. So which is sounds suspicious or strange, but I the actual story is I went to Starbucks and I like ordered a latte. I was actually meeting a friend of mine, and I was in San Jose, California, and I picked up 5 CDs from the counter. And this is back when Starbucks sold CDs, and I just moved them across the room, and nothing had been concealed or anything. I was just kind of like went and sat down, and then like almost instantly these cops walk up to me and they're like, stand up. And I kind of like set the CDs to my side, but as I stood up, they kind of like spilled on the floor. And it was like this thing where I hadn't actually done anything at that point.
Right.
But they were way too hostile and way too guns blazing, so to speak, for this to be just merely this guy looks a little suspicious the way he moved the CDs 20 feet from the counter. Let's go talk to him.
Yeah.
That was not the vibe of the interaction. And then as I was getting arrested, again for quote shoplifting, they had one of the cops was like foaming at the mouth and he's like screaming at me. He's like, I went to Iraq to protect this country from terrorists like you. And it's like, wait a minute, I thought I was arrested for shoplifting. Why are you calling me a terrorist? A little early for that. So I kind of knew they knew.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense because, yeah, I read about you just getting arrested and I was like, really? I mean, that's kind of scary, but it makes a lot more sense that they knew who you were and it was sort of set up because the situation just, you know.
Well, I'll give you the scoop. I never talked about this publicly, but I so I was talking about that sort of network of me being introduced to people like, hey, this person, you can trust them in this town. If you're in this town, they'll put you up and that whole thing. So I got introduced to Jacob Ferguson, who was a lead informant in what became called like the Green Scare case. So he was the person who was arrested on drug charges that wore a wire, and it brought down a bunch of people. So I never engaged in any illegal activity with him at all. I was not a part of that case
Hmm.
at all. But
Jerry and I
I
discussed that last episode.
that's right. Yeah, I watched that. So
Yeah.
I didn't know him casually just through that kind of, hey, go if you're ever in Eugene, go talk to this guy. And I had no context. I obviously no one. He was never introduced to me as like someone who's doing anything illegal. It was just kind of you can trust him. So um, I he over the course of me spending a little bit of time with him, he without getting into details, shared a little bit too much with him about what I was doing in the
Hmm.
rest of my life and some projects I was involved in, and some writing projects that I was doing and things like that. And so once unbeknownst to me and everyone else, he was cooperating with the government for a long time before that was known. And so I think they wanted to conceal his cooperation. I think they went to the FBI and just said, "Hey, here's who this guy is. Here's what town he lives in. Here's how you can find him. Here's his address." And the FBI sat back, and this is all kind of my theory, but I think it's pretty well founded. The FBI was like, "Okay, well, if we we can't just let this fugitive not get arrested, but if we arrest him in a way that doesn't seem happenstance or accidental, like we stumbled upon a crime, then it will reveal there's an informant. So we need to kind of wait for him to do something weird that we can use as a pretext, which is the Starbucks incident." So that's my theory. I believe that he was the one who actually led to my arrest.
Hmm. And, you know, for those of you who are watching, you probably noticed the name of this podcast is Green Scare, but as Peter was just talking about, what actually happened during the Green Scare was that corporate lobbying led to direct action activists such as Peter being considered eco-terrorists. The sort of new label was created for people who participated in ALF and ELF actions. And this was done after the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act was strengthened. So, Peter, how exactly has the Green Scare and stuff like this affected activism? Do you think the fear that it causes amongst activists, sort of pushes people back from going out and doing things? Like,
Yeah, I do. I've never been a proponent of this Green Scare narrative. I've always thought it
mhm,
did way more harm than good. I don't like the term Green Scare. I think it's something that's propagated largely by academics, not by people who actually have boots on the ground. And I think it's very convenient, and it kind of makes us seem cool, like, hey, we're being targeted by the government as terrorists. And like that is true. But at the same time, it certainly does not serve the movement to talk about or frame things as though the government is, going to put us all in jail because we're, waving a sign, or, send us to Guantanamo because we're releasing mink from farms. So I've always tried to take that conversation and spin it in an empowering direction, and not frame it as, hey, run for your life. Here's what the government's doing to stop us, but more kind of spin it back to, well, here's what we can do to stop them. And I think the Green Scare has had a tremendous, or the conversation around it has had a tremendous psychological, it's been psychologically detrimental to activists in terms of just people that aren't really legally savvy and don't really understand. They just hear this term and think, okay, wow, if I get involved in the ALF or activism, I'm going to be, in a supermax facility buried in a basement somewhere. I'm never going to see the light of day again. And that's just not the reality. So I don't like the conversation. I don't like people trying to build a name off of like Green Scare, Green Scare, Green Scare, and it's like, how does this serve the animals? How does this serve activism? It doesn't. I think we can talk about this conversation about what the government's doing to stop us in a way that is, at the end of the day, empowering and not disempowering. And so that's what I would hope people would do. So yeah, I mean, in terms of what, I don't even really consider the Green Scare to be a legitimate trend, illegal trend, but to the extent that it is a real thing, yeah, the government, it does want to put people in the ALF in prison, of course, and the ELF, etc. That's never not been the case, and I don't know, certainly some sentences have gotten more harsh, but again, this comes back to the academic perspective versus the boots on the ground perspective. The boots on the ground perspective is, the ALF knows the chance of getting caught are very slim. The ALF knows how to mitigate risk. People in the ALF know that, again, very, very few people actually get caught. And I don't think the quote Green Scare is going to dissuade anyone who would have otherwise done actions from continuing to do those actions. Now, what I think the Green Scare conversation can do is dissuade people that might have gone down that road from ever even considering going down that road. And that's where I think a lot of the damage lies. So, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I was the first person charged with animal enterprise terrorism, which under the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, which later became the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And it's not to say there aren't legal consequences for breaking the law. That's how the law works. But I think, we want to have the conversation that ends with, okay, got it. Here's how things are, understood. Now, what does this mean for animals? How is this not going to prevent us from doing the work that we need to do?
yeah. And I think, and I'm pretty much like I'm not a boots on the ground guy. I'm an academic myself, which is why I understand this as the Green Scare and frame it as the Green Scare. But I think what you brought up is something that's totally a totally great point there, which is something I just discussed with Jerry last week. Is that if fear or knowledge of the Green Scare leads people to give up effective activism, things like pressure campaigns or direct action, and instead spend excessive amounts of time doing what they call activism, but isn't really on cyberspace or something like that, it's really damaging for the movement. Have you seen a sort of decrease in the radical nature of the animal rights movement over time?
Absolutely. And it's hard to know what to credit that to, or credit's not the right word, but it's hard to know what to attribute that to. But I do think the Green Scare conversation has certainly been a part of that downward trend. And I also just think there isn't quite a culture to support it or to churn out, underground activists the way they used to be. We talked about the vegan straight edge scene. That was certainly a place where a lot of people got their start, and it's certainly not they didn't have a monopoly on the ALF, or ALF origins, but that was a big part of it. And you just don't really have that anymore. You've got a very um it's just a more fearful culture now. It's more of a narcotized culture. People are definitely hypnotized by the glowing screens, whether it's their phones or the internet or whatever. And so things are just very pacified. The culture's become very pacified. This has to be. I'm certainly not a historian that can really weigh in on this, but it seems like this is the first generation that's like more conservative than the one before it for many, many generations. And people are not. It's so funny when I meet people now that are even just like 15 years younger than me or something. I just talk about things that we all used to do, like we would just go suburban shenanigans. We would just go pick a building and see if we can get into it. Not even related to activism or what, just all these little things we used to do that were like technically illegal, but it's like not,
or
terribly
shoplifting from
consequential.
major corporations. I mean, I have people in my generation will literally narc each other out for that, which is insane to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you talk to people now and it's like, this stuff is just like, they're like mind blown. It's like, you used to do what? Like you used to jump on a box car and travel an hour to the next town. And it's like, it's interesting. People don't break laws for fun anymore, let alone, and that's how it starts, and then it becomes for a greater good. That doesn't happen anymore, and it's very difficult to transition from a life where you've lived completely inside the lines to the ALF. Most of the people I know, who I've done actions with, are people who, prior to being involved in the ALF, had gotten comfortable being outside the law, not in like a criminal, like thuggy sense, but just in a like mischief sense, and things that used to be normal. And so the experience of breaking the law was not foreign to them. And I think now people are so, I don't know if it's like the sense of we're in a surveillance state, or the internet just has us scared of everything. I don't know what to attribute it to, but people aren't really engaged in that kind of activity anymore on any level. So it's going to trickle down to activism.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just see that in general. I mean, if we look at like Roe v. Wade being overturned, I'm serious when I say if I think that happened in the 90s, I mean, there would have been riots. People would have just been far more radicalized about it than they were now. I think there's just a general feeling, partially of apathy, but also just of fear and self-direction, sort of within my generation. And I think you've spoken a lot in your books, etc., about what makes an effective activist. Would you like to go into detail about that a little bit while we're on the topic?
Yeah, I think we just touched on a big one, which is just being comfortable taking risks. I think a big part of being an effective activist is conquering fear and understanding that fear is usually the domain of people who think about scary things, not actually the ones doing them. I noticed very early on that when we were breaking laws, fear was completely absent in the moment. Like once you like that first snip of the fence, or like the point in a crime where you can't go back, fear is absent. You're 100% present. You're focused on the moment. You're focused on the goal. But it's not fear, because fear is sort of a luxury that you have when you're not actually, being chased by the gazelle or whatever the metaphor. When you're not actually in a situation where you have something to fear, that's when you're scared. Like you're scared driving to the farm. You're not scared on the farm. And so understanding that and understanding the remedy for fear is always action is huge. I think another thing that makes a good activist is understanding that luck is something that can be engineered. Luck is not, people look at, or not even just luck, but we can say success. So, you can look at something like, you can watch an old video of like activists breaking into like the University of Iowa or something like that, and you can go, wow, like these people really knew what they were doing, and they were really highly skilled and trained activists. And it's like a lot of success comes from just um, simply putting yourself in a situation where luck can present itself often enough. It's really a mathematical equation, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Like success is a math equation. It's like, how often can you put yourself in a situation where luck can present itself, and then luck will present itself eventually. And so I think that understanding that success slash luck is something that, again, that you can engineer is huge. I think that another big one is what I've heard called speed of execution, and minimizing that gap between when you think of something, something should be done, or you have a plan, and actually carrying out the plan. I've got some stories I'll probably never tell about really tragic situations where I had a plan, and I was, as much as I hate to talk about things I could have or would have done, I had a plan, and I was very serious about the plan, and I know that I had every intention of carrying it out, and I waited too long. And then those windows of opportunities close. And like, so I've had some really like stuff that will haunt me forever, that and I know it was my fault because I waited too long. And so the bigger the gap between when you plan something and when you actually carry it out, the less likelihood there is that that will actually happen. That plan will actually happen. So that's a big one. And I've also talked a lot about like killing the cop. The idea of like the cop in your head is a huge one. People walk around with a voice in their head that polices them, that tells them, don't do this, don't offend people, don't do this because you might go to jail. And to a sense, that can be a protective instinct, but most of the time you have this cop in your head that is policing you way more than anyone with a badge ever will. And it's always going to be to your detriment and the animal's detriment. And the way we talk to ourselves in our heads is insane. Like, you would never let anyone talk to you the way we talk to ourselves sometimes about like, oh, you don't have the skills to do this. You don't have the courage to do this. That's out of your league, right? Like, we always like talk ourselves down. So like, understanding there's a cop in our head that's always trying to keep us from doing what we know we have to do, is huge. So there's a lot of lessons like that. But I mean, these are kind of the, some of the things I think make a good activist. Also understanding that nobody has it figured out. Like, nobody has it figured out. Everyone learns by doing. Everyone thinks, again, if you watch an old video of an ALF raid, you think, oh, those people went to ALF training camp, or they really, they really have these skills that I don't have. And the fact is, everyone's making it up as you go. And I learned this later in business. Like, I have a business life, and you think that people that make money know what, have everything figured out. Everyone's just fumbling. No one has any idea what they're doing. They're just flailing around trying things. Every once in a while something works. Same thing with activism. It's not, if you wait until you have the right skills, you're never gonna get anything done. You learn by doing. And so it's that whole concept of just like, put yourself in a place where you want something to happen, trial and error, wait for luck to present itself, and learn in the moment, not from a book. But, read a little bit. You read one book on something, more than 99% of people in the world in that subject. At that point, just go do the thing. And then that's where you'll learn the rest that you need to be effective.
What do young activists nowadays need to understand about mass media, and how has social media and 21st century digital technology changed the game?
I don't have a tremendous amount to offer here. I think the internet has been a net negative for just about every aspect of our culture, except for making money. If you want to be an entrepreneur, internet's awesome. It's terrible for everything else. So, and that includes activism. This notion that like, oh, well, now we can send out a Facebook invite instead of an event page and get, easily reach hundreds of people. It's like, the math doesn't add up. Like, we got more people to our protests in 1996 before the internet than we do now. And there was no internet. and everyone's distracted now. They're not informed. They're just distracted. That's what the internet does. So I don't have a lot to offer here. That's profound, but I think de-emphasizing the role of the internet in any aspect of your life is a good idea.
Yeah, as you've said, animals don't die in cyberspace; they die in real life.
There we
Internet
go.
battles fought and is not going to help anyone. Um,
There we go.
so, you've published several books discussing the animal liberation front, and also your book, Blueprints, which was a comprehensive list of like information about fur farms. So, what inspired you or motivated you to write these books?
I started to think, yeah, it's actually a really specific answer to that. So I had started out, when I got out of prison, it was, you inevitably sit back, you're like, what's my role here? I could just go back to just being kind of normal, everyday activist. I certainly wasn't going to stop doing my part, but I didn't really know what my role was. So naturally you start to think, well, how can I sort of leverage everything I've been through for an outcome that maybe other people wouldn't be able to create in terms of I went to prison, I have these experiences. Maybe I can sort of just leverage that to bring something to the movement that no one else can at this particular moment in time. So that was kind of the idea. So I would like speak and I began to realize very quickly it was very discouraging because you give a lecture and there's 60 people in the room and you put a lot of effort into this a speech. And my idea at the time was I'll give a speech and I'll sit back and I will craft the speech in such a way that I want to be talking to my 18-year-old self. Like if I imagine myself being 18, what did I need to hear? What were the obstacles in my head that prevent me from doing more? And so I kind of listed those things off. Like I remember like, okay, like I don't know how to get inside a building. Okay, so I can give a lecture where I plant tactical advice in the stories, right? So I was like doing that kind of stuff. And I was like crafting these talks for the person that, is sitting in that audience that maybe they could actually hear what I have to say and actually go out. And maybe what I have to offer will be like the final piece of the puzzle they need to go out and do good things for animals. So that was the idea. And then also part of that was like, the media would come to me and they'd say, "Can we get a quote on this?" And I'd talk to the media about the ALF, so that was kind of like part of what I was doing at that time. And I have tremendous respect for, like you mentioned, Jerry Vlasic and the North American Animal Liberation Press Office, and tremendous respect for that work. But what I personally started to feel like it was just very too transient for me. You give a talk, you do this, I'll put all this work into this thing or the media, whatever, and it's just in the ether seconds after it
Mm-hmm.
happens. And so I didn't really see the impact. And so it's like, well, what am I doing if there's not an impact? Um, and I didn't see, I'm going around the country giving speeches. Not seeing this surge of ALF activity follow, my appearances. So like, what am I doing? Like, I'd be much better off just handing out vegan literature on a college campus. So what I started to kind of, after a couple of years of that, I started to think, all right, so this isn't really, maybe it's not that effective. And so I began to think, well, what was effective for me? And for me, it was always printed matter. Um, it wasn't seeing something on a computer screen. It was like I would get like publications and I would get like books, and those had a much bigger impact on me than like a million, website views. So I wanted to take, what not just my knowledge, but other people's knowledge and put them into some permanent record that could never be rewritten. It can never be revised by, you know, anyone. And I want to have like this permanent, indelible record and again, I don't know. The ALF is a very small part of the animal rights movement. I don't want to exaggerate the role of the ALF. There's tremendous victories being won for animals on every front, but this is one area where I thought I had something to offer, right? So I the thing about the ALF is that the information was so disparate. So it was like there's like old faded publications, maybe there's a PDF online somewhere, and then there's like there was no standard, like there was no document you could hand someone and go, here is the ALF, right? There's some good books out there, like Free the Animals, but there was just no like one book. So I published a bunch of old publications in book form, like this one called Underground. It was a North American I forget what they were called, Animal Liberation Press Office circa the 90s. They had a publication, so I reprinted all that material. So now it's not going to just be some PDF on the internet. It's like a physical document that can sit in a library, can sit somewhere, and people can be, read for generations. And then I published a collection of writings and lecture transcripts that I had given over the years or written over the years. And so I actually think I have a couple of them right here. Um, so yeah, so that was this book called Liberate. So that was basically I was just like, you know what, this is everything I have to say on this subject. And I can just kind of put it out there. And maybe it's just for posterity, maybe it'll have an impact, but let me just put it out there and just kind of, this is what I have to say about this. I don't need to rehash these subjects for the rest of my life, right? I would just have some book I can give people. But then the one I actually would really recommend people read is and this has been an undertaking that took me a bunch of years, but I kind of referenced before, like, there was no like one book. If you were like, someone was just like, I want to get involved in the ALF or I want to know about them. If you're an academic, there's no book you go, here's the book, right? And think about any movement, every field of study has like the book. They're kind of the pillar, right? And the ALF didn't have that. And so what I want to do is take every piece of writing that anyone from the ALF had ever written, whether it was an anonymous communique, an anonymous how it was done article about how, activists broke into the University of Arizona in 1989, or every how-to guide, or every interview, and like as much as I could from the people who actually had carried out ALF actions and put them in a single book. And so this kind of felt like this is the document I've really been building up to. And so that ended up being this book, which is called ALF Strikes Again, and it's massive. It's like 700, I think it's 702 pages, but it's my attempt to put together everything the ALF has written ever. And so, it served a couple functions, some of which I already referenced, but another one that I haven't is that the ALF is very ripe it's very ripe for revisionists, historical revisionists. It's very ripe to be victimized by historical revisionists because the ALF can't speak for themselves, right? You carry out a crime, you can't, other than the few people who've been caught, like myself, there's not really people who can stand up and go, oh, actually, this is not how it happened. And so you can have the potential for people to really rewrite the history of the ALF in a way that can't be challenged. And I wanted the ALF to have a document where they could speak for themselves. And again, I'm a very small part of this, right? But that book, The ALF Strikes Again, is my attempt to take everything that was written in one place, and so that nobody can go, oh, actually, no one can rewrite history, and it's not going to be a PDF that's going to be lost on some website. It's a permanent document. And so I'm actually most proud of that one. I had spent several years before this book. This book came out in 2022 or one. I had spent several years, basically in a bubble building a business. And I eventually sold that business. And I think everyone has that kind of thought of like, if they ever like sell your business or whatever, you ever like retire, like what's the first thing you're going to do, right? A lot of people, it's like, I don't know. Everyone's got that thing where it's like, if I can finally not have to work, like what would I do? So when I sold my business, I knew the first thing I want to do was finish this book. And so it's the book I really recommend anyone who has any interest in anything we've talked about here. That's the book that I think they should read. And the story actually, it's kind of not that crazy, but I started working on this book years ago, and the FBI came and raided my house. This is 2010, and they took all the files from it.
Oh no!
And so that was I put a tremendous amount of work. Some of the stuff that's in this book, like it's honestly, I think I might be one of the only people that actually has some of these documents. It wasn't anything you can find on the internet, some of it, and I would really spend a lot of time compiling some rare ALF literature for this book. FBI takes it all, and I was like, it was obviously a major setback. And eventually, years and years later, I got all the files back. So they called me and are like, hey, come get your stuff. So I got the files back. So that's when I was able to kind of pick up the project again. So that's kind of why there's a couple of the reasons why I wanted to put books out. I think books have a bigger impact than anything on the internet. And history gets rewritten, and we should try to protect that history to the best we can. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do.
What are some of the most interesting things you found while compiling information and researching the ALF?
I wouldn't say there's a whole lot I didn't know, but it is fascinating how well, for one, so there's some material in here that's like pretty old. One thing that was interesting is not a lot of it, but some of it came from old PETA newsletters. Like PETA used to actually publish interviews with the ALF, and some people know this, but some people don't. That PETA used to, not just champion the ALF, but they actually used to tacitly admit, like, hey, we actually know who some of these people are. And I thought it was very cool. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting, if you contrast this maybe to the present day, is just how singularly focused the people in the ALF were. Like, it was always kind of when they would communicate with the public, or however they would whoever they were, other activists, it was always focused on the animals. And it wasn't there was not a whole lot of, well, let me use this as an opportunity to share my opinion about 100 and other social issues, all of which are, I'm sure, valid, but it was very like mission focused. Like, hey, this is about the animals, and our political differences don't mean much in this context. So I appreciated that, and I mean, I just any bit of tactical knowledge somebody wants, which I think is, I think fear and tactics are the two things that hold people back. And so if you can manage to conquer the fear, which is sort of the internal, it's the tactics become the only obstacle. And tactically, I think everything is covered here. I mean, you've got people talking about how they break into labs, and I mean, it's just the whole spectrum of tactical knowledge is shared here, which I think makes it also a very cool resource.
So, Peter, you did 2 years in federal prison. What was that like, and have there been any other kind of sort of intense moments you faced in activism or in your life? And what have they taught you?
Prison was, I mean, if on the list of intense things that have happened, I think prison is probably a lower on that list. Prison was, it's not what people think it is. I went to a federal prison, which is very distinct from a state prison. You've got 50 state prison systems in the federal system, and all those have their own individual cultures. And also within each of those, you've got like various security levels and things. So you can't really talk about prison generally. But I got to prison thinking it was one thing, and it turns out it was something entirely different. I thought it was going to be this like Darwinian hell where I was going to be, having like a physical fight for survival, and that just did not happen. I didn't get in any fights in prison. I remember before, in the years leading up to prison, I knew I was going to go to prison. So I was always like reading literature about prison, and it turns out it really polluted my head about what prison was like. And that was actually one of the reasons I wanted to put out that book, Liberate. There was a compilation of stuff I've written that I referenced earlier, is because I want to demystify prison, because there was no resource for activists when it came to prison. That's just a small part of the book. But so prison, when I got there, is really a game of social skills more than anything. It's not about your physical might. And so when I got to prison, I realized that the things that will get you far in life outside of prison work in prison as well. It's just a matter of building rapport with people, having some alliances that are strategic, and you'll do just fine. So I had to kind of play that game. I remember there was a situation where when I was arrested, I had an ID card on me in the state of Virginia, and it was an ID card that was obtained with forged documents. So the state of Virginia came and charged me with this document forgery. So I had two concurrent cases, and Virginia, while I was in federal prison, flew me out to state prison to deal with, or to state court to deal with those charges, and then flew me back to federal prison. So I went, at the time they flew me out, I wasn't exactly new to prison, but there was definitely some uncertainty as to where I stood in the social sphere of the prison that I was in. And this is in Victorville, California. So I got to federal prison. A few months later, they shipped me to Virginia. So I'm talking about playing the social chessboard that I referenced earlier. So I had written an article in a publication called the Earth First Journal, and it was just little one-page editorial about snitches and my opinions on that. And people, it's a very sensitive subject in prison, of course. People don't like snitches because most people are there because they got snitched on, and then a lot of people have strong opinions because they are snitches secretly, but they want to act like they're not, so they try to overcompensate by being anti-snitch. So everyone's anti-snitch to one degree or another. And I I didn't cooperate, and I was offered, several plea bargains that involved cooperation. And so when I wrote this essay in the Earth First Journal, they sent me a copy of it. And you can't go. So if you are confirmed to having, as someone who took more time in prison because you refused to snitch, that is very much respected in prison.
Mm.
And you can't exactly go around being like, "Hey, everybody, guess what I didn't do?" Or you can't really go and like flex like that. But when I got shipped off to Virginia State Court, there is a rule, not really rule, but like a policy in prison where they'll keep all your stuff while you're away. Because this happens a lot. People get moved, to court, it gets shipped off to court and stuff. They'll keep your stuff, but magazines are specifically excluded. So what I did is I secretly threw away like all my magazines except for like 3. And one of them was the Earth First Journal. And then I went to the guy in the next cell who was called the shot caller. He's like the top of the jail hierarchy, prison hierarchy in terms of the cell block. And I went to him and I was like, "Hey man, they're shipping me out tomorrow. And they make you throw away the magazine. So I thought I'd just like leave these with you." But I slid in the Earth First Journal. And the reason I threw away the others is because I want to make sure that he saw this article.
Mm.
And so I give it to him, and I get shipped off. I come back a few weeks later after I dealt with all that. And I came back into the dining hall my first day back. And the entire dining hall was just like, "What's up, Young?" And people like high-fiving me. And it was like what do you call it? Like a ticker tape parade or something. And it was a total change of vibe. Nobody even acknowledged me before. And it was and I found out later when I finally got my magazines back, because the same guy, he's like, "Hey man, here's your stuff." And it was like creased open to that article, and you could tell it had like been passed around to a bunch of other people. And it was one of the things I had to do to kind of make my experience a lot easier. And so I remember shortly after that, I was on the prison yard, like the outdoor yard area, and you've got the shot caller. This is probably really goofy to people that have no idea what I'm talking about, but like never been to prison. But there you got the prison shot callers who are the top of the hierarchy in the cell block. But then you've got the actual, oh no, sorry, the unit reps. People that went to prison are going to be screamed at the screen right now. I misspoke. The unit reps are the top of the hierarchy within the cell block. Then you've got the shot callers who are the top of the hierarchy for the entire prison.
Mm.
And it's all prisoner, this is not, the shot caller is not assigned that status by the prison staff. It's all within the prisoners, right?
No, this is
But the
prison
point
lingo,
is,
I get it. Yeah.
yeah, but they can make or break your experience. If the shot callers don't like you, you are screwed. And so I remember I was on the prison yard, and there was a shot caller. There was 2 shot callers, and one of them was talking to another guy, and I was like really far away from them, so they didn't think I could hear them. But because they were like on the racquetball court, there was like this acoustic anomaly where it was like, like sometimes you can like hear stuff, it's like right next to you, but you're like it's like ricocheting off stuff or whatever.
Yeah,
So I could hear what they were saying, and this guy is like, "Hey man, what do you think about Young?" And they're like talking about me, and the guy's like, "I don't, well, like why?" And he's like, "I don't know, man. That guy's kind of weird. He doesn't talk to anyone. He seems kind of private, which is something you really shouldn't. It's kind of frowned upon, if you kind of keep to yourself." So he's like, "Yeah, I don't really think I like that guy. Like he keeps to himself too much." And the shot caller he goes, "Yeah, Young, he doesn't really interact much with us, but let me tell you something. That is no motherfucking snitch." And it's like right then I was like, I got a free pass. I can get away with anything now. Like no one's gonna mess with me, because I had like the stamp of like no snitching approval from the shot caller. So it was a lot of that. I had to build rapport with people that otherwise I would probably never interact with in the outside world. So there's a lot of that. Like I said, never got into a fight. Being vegan was definitely the hardest part, but I was able to do that as well. And
What was it like
lots
being
of,
vegan?
I mean, like I said, it's the hardest part. I was in like 6 or 7 different jails and then 1 prison. So I just kind of 8 answers to that question, but because everyone is a different system you have to navigate. But it was tough. There were times where I had this hunger strike to get vegan food. I was really fortunate to have support on the outside. So, there would be like people blowing up their phone if I wasn't getting food. And so I was really privileged in that sense. But I was able to make it work. But again, really, really hard. I mean, you get put into a new jail. They don't know or care that you're vegan. You're getting the same food as everybody else, and you'd have to deal with it and make lots of noise to get anyone to pay attention to you. And sometimes that involves many days without eating.
Hmm.
Um, so it was a challenge.
Did you ever go on hunger strike?
Yeah, there's a couple. The longest I ever went without a full meal was I think 12 days.
Hmm.
There was multiple like 3-day hunger strikes. In 3 days, there's some I don't know, some legal consulting firm or something that told all the jails in the country like ignore a hunger strike for 3 days, but after the third day, it becomes a medical problem potentially. So like the prisoner becomes like a legal liability. So then at that point you should pay attention. So it was always like the 3-day mark after like the what is that like the ninth meal that you reject. You always got someone at your cell door. Hey, what's going on? What do you need? Like all of a sudden they become very attentive. So hunger striking does work, but it's tough.
All right. Yeah, anything. We were just talking about your experiences in prison. Any sort of intense moments you faced in your activism, or anything that comes to mind? And what did that teach you?
Oh gosh, tons. I mean, I referenced it was the first time we went to a farm, we got chased. And there's been a lot of that. On the campaign that got me sent to prison, there was a moment where we were on a fur farm and we get to the farm, we open a single cage just to sort of figure out how the latching mechanism worked. A mink jumped out and ran away. And they were kind of regrouping, getting ready to start, like actually start opening cages en masse. And my co-conspirator taps me on the shoulder, and I look back, and there is a fur farmer marching towards us down the shed, like fearlessly. So we had to run. And my co-defendant was an electrical engineer, and so he had rigged up our car. It's kind of cool actually. He rigged up a car where there was he mounted a switch on the dash that you could flip, and it turned off every light, not just the headlights, turned off the brake lights. Like so, we were just this invisible
Wow.
mass moving through a cornfield. So that kind of got us out of that situation. There have been times where I remember there was one time where God, how much should I talk? How much should I talk about? Excuse me. There was one time where we there was a building we wanted to get into, and we lifted up the skylight and dropped a fire escape ladder inside this building. And this was actually not me. I actually was not the one that went inside. I was just on top. But this person drops down the ladder, starts walking. All of a sudden, we hear these alarms blaring, and he starts scurrying up the ladder, and he'd set off alarms, and we had to run for it, and we had to pull the ladder up and box it up and get on. There was a time where we were doing something that involved us having to go to this building in advance and basically um cut away something that was covering a window so that we can come back at night and enter through the window. But we had to want to cut it in advance. We didn't want to be carrying bulky equipment to the site, so we want to go there like in the middle of the day and do the work really quick, and then so it was already ready for us when we got there. And oh no, it wasn't wires. It specifically was a crowbar. It's something we had to we had to like pry up like a grate or something. But anyway, we did that, and as I'm walking away in this area that you was definitely no reason to be in, a cop just comes, I mean, just like out of nowhere, just comes walking towards us, and and like I think on foot patrol, but like we didn't know it wasn't for us specifically, and so I like I managed to like get the crowbar down my pants, but as I'm walking, it's like sliding down my pants, like and like falling out as we're walking past this cop. So I'm trying to like lean down, like I'm scratching my leg, but I'm really holding this crowbar. There was just so many close calls, like I mean that is that's a whole episode.
Wow.
I would encourage anybody that's interested in this type of activity to just start putting yourself out there. Don't wait for a blueprint. You don't want to wait for the perfect opportunity to present itself, because that opportunity will just simply never come. You want to just, and this kind of touches on something I already talked about, which is like continuously put yourself in situations, in physical proximity of where you want something to happen, whether it's
Mm.
as simple as just going to a farm, whether it's as simple as going to a lab or whatever you want to do. Just simply kind of put yourself there repeatedly, and it's almost like metaphysical or supernatural about what will happen. And so most people never get to that stage. They think they get stuck in the research phase, right? And I think particularly with internet research, I mean, you shouldn't be looking this stuff up on your computer anyway. But the point is, I mean, research becomes a substitute for doing the thing,
Mm.
and talking about these things becomes a substitute for doing the thing. And one of the reasons I think that the internet is such a detriment to activism in many ways is that the more there's this term in psychology called narcotizing dysfunction, which I think is fascinating, but the idea is basically the more you talk about something, the further you get from doing it, because talking about something satisfies the part in your brain that is normally satisfied by actually action. And so the internet allows us just to like editorialize endlessly. And so we almost convince ourselves on a psychological level or subconscious level that we are like frontline warriors when all we've done is just, editorialize on the internet for years on end. And so I would encourage people to kind of get out of that, get out of the research mode, get out of the opinion mode. The animals don't care how skilled you are, how perfectly your plan is executed, or how perfectly something is planned. They don't care about your opinions. Just put yourself out there into the real world, where you want things to happen. I think that sort of idea of just like getting out of your house is becoming increasingly lost the last decade or two. And I think it's really important. I think even though we live in an increasingly um, technological surveillance state, I think everything there's a solution to every problem when it comes to security. Whether that means de-emphasizing vehicles as part of an action and riding a bike to the action. It's something we never had to think about before, but no reason you can't do that. Or whether it means, um, going out and doing something by yourself because, of increased risk of involving other people, because you got to like coordinate with a bunch of other people who all have cell phones and all this. There's all this stuff to coordinate now you didn't have to think about before. All this stuff can be overcome. So, definitely I would encourage people to shift in the mode of like, of, what can they like a problem solving mode versus a defensive mode.
Okay, so now we have a question from a viewer. Thanks for the question, Witt. So, Peter, what would non-human relations look like in your ideal world? So, when we get I say when, if we ever get a vegan world, how would human beings be living alongside animals in this world?
There is no reason for us to interact with animals. They would live their lives. I mean, there's nothing I could say that's again terribly profound here, but we would just simply leave animals alone, the way they leave us alone, unless they're trying to kill us and eat us, which can happen. But not being.
They certainly don't factory farm us.
They don't factory farms, but yeah, just leaving animals alone. I mean, it's the simplest answer.
Yeah. Because actually, you bring that up. I see a lot of people who are vegan nowadays who lean more into the effective altruism kind of side of things, and they actually have ideas about like policing nature and like killing predators or ridiculous things like that. And I feel like what they've done is they've just traded the human god complex over animals for another one. Really, like giving up the role of tyrant, that doesn't mean we have to, be like a sort of nanny state over animals either.
Sure. I will say that is not new to effective altruism. I remember people like that from day one
Yeah.
of me getting involved. I always remember there's people that wanted to euthanize all carnivorous animals. So
I'm actually surprised it's not a newer thing, but that's
yeah,
amazing.
no, it's not.
Wow. Okay, well, yeah, I think your vision of animal liberation is probably the standard amongst people in the radical movement. Um, Thank you so very much for joining me, Peter. I think we talked about a whole lot of things, and I really want to thank you for going into depth about a lot of stuff that you've never spoken